So, time for some final tweaks. Having a look at this render here, I can tell that I'm going to want to just increase that directional light a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and just tweak that lighting, and then from there we're going to have a quick look at our render settings and how we can set this up for rendering, and then we'll go ahead and finally set up our render layers so we can prepare to comp our shot. So first things first, let's just go into our light editor, get our directional light, and I'm going to bump the exposure up to 3. So that should give us a nice boost in our directional light. So let's just screenshot that render and have a look at what we've just done. And hopefully we'll just get a bit more directional lighting on this side, sort of slightly stronger. Yeah, something like that. Just to push things a little bit, help us with the contrast. We can play with this in post, but it's just good to have it in a good area, good place before we render it. So that's looking better. Now let's go into our rendering settings. Now in the first tab, it's good to set this up accordingly. So we're going to be using some AOVs. So the first thing we want to do is merge our AOVs so that we have everything in one EXR. And another thing we'll do is we'll switch this to half precision. That'll just make it more memory efficient. It'll be 16 bits, so we'll get away with that with this shot, and I think that'll be fine. And then for compositing apps like Fusion and Nuke, if we turn off tiled, that will make it faster for their scanline renderers. So we'll turn off tiled. Now, if you were to use Nuke, if you turn on auto crop, in this case it won't help us because it's not, the whole frame will be filled with detail. But if you were to render like if there was a patch of smoke here on a render layer and that was the only thing in that layer, then auto crop would make it so that in Nuke's scanline that would only render that part of the image in the scanline. But we don't need that just yet, so we'll turn that off. And then to go along with our non-tiled EXR, so our scanline EXR, we want to change the compression type to zips because that also reads faster in Nuke and Fusion. So that's our first file output setup. And then as we're rendering a sequence, let's change the frame/animation to name.hash.ext, and this will set it up to render a sequence. Frame padding 4 is fine. And then let's just change the end frame to 120, and then if you've still got your perspective camera here, make sure you change it to render cam, and if you've got more than one camera, just delete it. We just want our render camera here. 1080p is fine, we'll go with the 1080p resolution. And then on to our Arnold settings. Now as we've got foliage, it may be necessary to increase the subsurface scattering if you've got that on your leaves. For this particular shot, I think we're far away enough to get away with it. Volume indirect, we'll keep that as is because we'll be using that for our cloud layer. And then the camera AA, obviously, if you crank this up, you'll get a cleaner render. I think for now, we'll actually just leave these as default. But if you end up with quite a noisy render, you might want to crank this up. And then if we go to our ray depth, you've got diffuse specular transmission and volume here, and by default volume is set to 0, but we want some rays in our volume, so what we want to do is maybe increase this to 1 or 2, so we get some bouncing going on in our volumes. So let's increase that, and let's also increase the maximum, the total, let's increase that to 12. And also increase our diffuse bounces. So at the moment we're only getting 1 bounce. If we change it to 2, we'll just get a little bit more indirect lighting. So it will increase the render times, but that will just help with our realistic lighting. So now we've done that, we've set up our ray depth. We'll do a test render in a moment, but that's what we're going to set for the ray depth. And then I'm not going to turn on motion blur for my renders, but you can enable it. It shouldn't impact the render time too much, but if you want motion blur, then you can enable that now. And then let's take a look at the AOVs we're going to include in these renders. So firstly, we're going to want a Z pass so we can have some depth information to help us create some sort of atmosphere. Is this is a large scale scene, so let's add that. And next we're going to want some volume passes, so the volume AOVs. We're going to add all of them. This will just give you loads of control with your cloud pass, so let's add those. And then finally we want to add a crypto object, so we'll have a crypto mat as well, so you can have masks for your trees and for your ground, etc. So we'll add that. And then we're not going to add any more, but if you wanted to break down, say, the specular and the diffuse, then you can add the diffuse direct and indirect, and then you've also got the same for the specular here. But we're not going to go into that in this tutorial. So these are the AOVs we're going to use, and we won't use them all in one layer. For example, in our beauty layer, we'll turn all of these off. So with that in mind, let's proceed to the next lesson and set up our render layers.